Hello and welcome to the Kestrel Colonial Force All Regiments tier list. In this video, we'll be going through every regiment in the Kestrel Colonial Force and ranking them from S to F, using that as an opportunity to talk a little bit about their role, describe how they play, and then assigning them, as we do in tier lists, of value. N5 as an addition has existed long enough now to be able to kind of do this on an actual regiment by regiment basis inside factions, but I should stress that this very much will be an internal view of these regiments. We aren't particularly interested in comparing them to similar regiments in other factions. And the goal here will really be to assess these from a pan-Oceanian perspective. We'll be looking at them in sort of an internal balance kind of way, ranking them purely in terms of how they compare to other regiments inside Kestrel Colonial Force, very much putting ourselves in the mind of the pan-Oceanian player and comparing these as a Kestrel Colonial player, not in the broader context of Infinity. Now we're going to try and move through this relatively quickly because there are of course a lot of regiments, and we're beginning with the Armbots. This is all done in alphabetical order, so we'll be jumping back and forth between a lot of different regiments, and we have to start with Armbots Bulletier and Armbot Peacemakers. Now, both of these regiments fill kind of an important role, but a secondary important role in Kestrel Colonial Force, where they are mechanized combat remotes. Of the two, the Peacemaker is generally going to be the more important. Kestrel doesn't have a way to link Bulletiers, for example, so the synergy with the Bulletier is a little bit lower, but the Peacemaker is a perennially useful piece that in Kestrel is really only competed with by the Jackals. Jackals can do the kind of things that a Peacemaker will in the midfield, not be a repeater but do many of the other things, but the Peacemaker in particular is still a very valuable element. Not something that you put in every list, neither is the Bulletier, but combat remotes form just kind of a baseline capability that's useful in just about any faction, and of course, speaking as a pan-Oceanian player assessing these units, the Bulletier and Peacemaker are no different. Up next, we have the Banshee Airborne Assault Unit. Running anything from 19 to 25 points, with a variety of exclusively short-range weapons, combining multi-spectral visor level 1 with all of the suite of tools you would expect of a combat jump, super jump model. Banshees are one of two units that can kind of fill this role in Kestrel Colonial Force, the other of course being the Parachutist Deployment Zone Black Air, and the Banshee Airborne Assault Unit is the more accessible of the two, but probably the slightly less powerful. It's nevertheless a high utility piece. It's medium infantry and has an MSV1 and has hacking profiles, which means it's quite good at doing classifieds, and as a combat jump troop with Phys 12, which is serviceable in terms of landing. It's cheap enough and accessible enough to slot into some Kestrel Colonial Force plans. Now, one of the things that it doesn't have that you might compare if we were to take off our Pan-Oceanian hat for a moment and compare it to other similar profiles elsewhere in the game is that its super jump with the 6.6 move or with jet propulsion might allow it to get into the fight quickly, but with just light shotgun and submachine gun rangeman weapons, it does still have to close all the way back in terms of distance if it fails to land, but it's still a parachutist, it's useful, it's good to have something like this in every single faction, so it kind of fits again into that baseline capability style of tool. Up next we have BCA Magistrates. Now, these are exclusively command and control troops. They are fireteam masters with Jackals, which means you can form a fireteam that will turn the Jackals regular, which is a serviceable thing to do if you have a Haris slot spare to do that. But the more important way to think of BCA Magistrates is as counterintelligence tools with either chain of command or Strategos Lieutenant profiles at a very, very accessible price point. Either of those tools, not usually both in the same list, can be very valuable. But this isn't, for example, a profile that you're looking to gunfight with except as a last resort. A bit like a lot of the other profiles we've talked about so far, these guys form what we might call that kind of baseload capability, something that's really good to just have in a list, even if it isn't necessarily the focus of the list. And Kestrel Colonial Force really benefits from having access to BCA Magistrates. One of the things I think Kestrel players have found over time is that Fireteam Master role really does represent a compromise. You can't always have the Haris team that you might want turning to Jackals regular, but even if you don't avail yourself of that, a counterintelligence Strategos Lieutenant for as little as 19 points is a big deal. Now, next up we have Beast Hunters. Beast Hunters are a piece that's been ubiquitous basically since their release in N4. And at least personally over time, I would describe myself as having become kind of less and less enamored with them over that time. Pan-Oceania, and that includes Kestrel, has access to a +1 burst heavy flamethrower profile, which clocks in at a very expensive 17 points for an irregular piece. And they don't really have an effective tool to fork with that heavy flamethrower, which leaves you just placing flamethrower templates over and over again, hoping that something will be accomplished as your opponent dodges. Now, if your opponent fails the dodge, then yes, 2 heavy flamethrower templates is a pretty significant connection, but they're not a unit that is racing to the top of my particular ranking in Kestrel Colonial Force, just because I think there are other things that I might want to do that role, if it's even a role I particularly want in the first place. Next up, we've got the Black Air, and this is where things are starting to get spicy. Now, we're going to stick to the way that we're ranking these here, which is from the Kestrel Pan-Oceanian player's perspective and on a regiment-by-regiment basis. But we really do need to acknowledge that the Black Air Regiment has an awful lot of things that are kind of going on. This is where we see the Parachutist Deployment Zone profile, and it's also where we see probably the most dominant Black Air profile, which is the Neurokinetics Multi-Sniper MSV2 Mimetism 3 FTO profile. Now, this is a very expensive profile. This is 33 points for a single wound infantry person. But with all of the tools available to this profile, whether you're taking the Neurokinetic Sniper or the Deployment Zone Parachutist, there's a lot of really fearsome potential here. I think in particular, if we're looking at the Sniper as probably the most dominant of the profiles that represents the Black Air, we do need to acknowledge this is a single wound trooper. Unlike, say, John Hawkwood, oops, we're comparing with other factions again, let's not do that. Within the premise of Kestrel Colonial Force, something that quite performs like a Black Air. Now, the main reason, there are a few reasons why I'm not going to rank this higher, but one of the reasons why we might not rank this as a purely dominant piece, apart from just, for example, considerations of its stats, is that expensive single wound ARO pieces are always going to be something of a risk. There are pieces that can lay out marksman turrets in Kestrel Colonial Force. They have the only turret mine layer profile, which means you have access between that and other mine layers to ablative defenses, other close-in defenses. You have a mix, and the Black Air forms part of that mix, but it's not something that I would necessarily suggest including in every profile. Nevertheless, we're going to rank it above kind of our baseline elements before moving on to the Blink team. Now, the Blink team realistically has 1 and a bit profiles. This is really all about the heavy rocket launcher that's got an increased power probability of survival. 28 points and 1.5 years SWC gets you most of a Noctifer. It's ballistic skill 13, it isn't packing a missile launcher, but the heavy rocket launcher range bands are more forgiving. And compared to a Noctifer, it's got higher ballistic skill. Whoops, we're comparing to other factions again. On its own merits, the Blink team is a terrifying aero piece. Now, also not something that you would put in every list, but the presence of a Blink team, when combined with Deployment Zone Parachutists and Combat Jump Troopers and some hidden deployment pieces other than the Blink team, means that the existence of a Blink team helps play into the fog of war that your opponent is facing. Provided all of your SWC isn't accounted for, whenever you have anything that's hidden, your opponent has to consider the possibility of both a Blink team and other stuff, and that's valuable. If you wanted to go really ham on ARO options, you could even do things like combine the Blink team with a Black Air, hidden deploy the Blink team in the location that you then deploy the Black Air into, and have possibly one of the scariest stacked ARO options as both models reveal the Blink team displaces to a legal position after taking its ARO, and having just a horrifying burst 4 effective of truly terrifying firepower back, which makes the Blink team, again, single wound, sometimes food, not for every list, but terrifying when it appears. Up next, because we are continuing on through in alphabetical order, we've come to the Clipper Dronebot. As we'll discuss with other remotes and we've discussed with remotes before this is baseline capability kind of stuff. The Clipper is somewhat important to Kestrel Colonial Force, but Kestrel Colonial Force is not really a guided missile faction. It's fine to have access to tools like this. We're going to rank it just as a baseline piece in C, but it's not something that we're really going to spend much time emphasizing. Now, Dart Optimate Huntress is up next, and she's a piece that I don't think I've seen appear in a single Kestrel Colonial Force list yet. Now, she's not a bad piece exactly, but 34 points for the suite of tools that she brings is something that I don't think the game is particularly crying out for at the moment. There was a time when, for example, no wind incapacitation on her and shock immunity was a really, really big deal. She could, be part of a midfield skirmisher mix, old Shock Army of Acontecimento players will remember how that worked and how effective it was. But there isn't quite the same amount of stuff for her to hide amongst. There is some, right? You can build a midfield that includes camouflage markers that can disguise Dart's presence, but it's more just like, well, what is Dart doing exactly that I need done in this list? Well, she's very good at doing classifieds, yes, but a submachine gun in N5 is just not doing that much that we particularly care about. And so she is a big and expensive profile, 34 points, built around a ballistic skill 13 submachine gun. More than anything, it's realistically that submachine gun change across editions, and just that everything else has changed around her and she has not moved particularly much other than to cop that slight nerf and the slight nerf to coming plus that's left her kind of behind a little bit. Next up we have Archaeo Raider Dr. Priia Harper. Now, this is an expensive profile that I have nevertheless played against in some lists. Admittedly, I have mostly played against Dr. Harper in meme lists, because it is possible to get significant SWC counts, which lets you do some very funny things, for example, with multiple blink teams, etc. But she's a tricky model to really take full advantage of in the context of the things that she brings to the faction. She reads kind of like she's meant to be, she wildcards into fire teams where she has tactical awareness, but she's paying an awful lot of points for being a tactical awareness fire team member, when at the end of the day, for all of the weird and interesting weapons that she's packing, you don't really want to gunfight with her, right? That is a ballistic skill 12 X-Visor plasma carbine, and yes, plasma is awesome, but unless you have a really, really specific plan for that SWC cost, I think she is mostly relegated to meme stonk kind of lists. Nevertheless, she has some place in some lists, which is more than can be said, for example, for Dart. Continuing on into the Ds, we have Drummers, Mobile Support Section. Now, I will admit that this is a regiment that I was hugely, hugely keen for when Kestrel began to be spoiled early on in the pre-edition. And it's definitely a regiment that I maintain a degree of aesthetic enthusiasm for. But as people have begun to explore and play Kestrel Colonial Force, it has proven just very difficult to actually fit them into lists. They are just expensive enough, right? The 21-point model should be affordable, but I have not seen it in any Kestrel Colonial Force lists yet. And the 42-point HRMC is really, really difficult to afford in this faction. There are so many pieces in Kestrel that are competing for play that they're just a difficult inclusion, particularly since you want to go ahead and do things like take an Evo hacker to help support them. Now, their model is coming out. It was spoiled at the Adepticon seminar that was posted by Corvus Belli just very, very recently. And so I have some hope that with models appearing, people will begin to experiment with them and we'll get to see what drummers are truly capable of, even if what they're truly capable of is just that the 20-point profile is really pretty awesome. Drummers are coming in at the bottom of B, and we're moving into Emily Handleman in the E's. Now, Emily Handleman is a piece that I have seen appear in Kestrel Colonial Force lists, and I don't know why. She can wildcard, for example, into a Fusilier link, and yes, I suppose she has Chain of Command, and a ballistic skill 14 X-Visor EM grenade launcher is funny, but Kestrel really shouldn't need to play the game that way, and if you do want to play the game that way, you have other speculative fire options elsewhere that are either much, much, much more affordable in the form of Jackals, or have higher ballistic skill in the form of Squalos. I think if everything comes together, it's absolutely possible to have a game where that EM grenade launcher pays off, because electromagnetic weapons are, of course, they can be very impactful on the game state, but even then we have to remember that switch on exists, and I just have to conclude that the games where she is highly impactful are just going to be rare. Similarly, through the E's and into the F's, we have Father Lucien Sforza. Sforza technically got a glow up in this edition, but I have nothing particularly at all to say about him. I don't even really have the time or the mental energy in this video to spend time damning him. There's no point putting him in any list in any of the factions that he exists in. Now, out of the niche piece that is Lucien Sforza and into Fennec Fusiliers in the Fs, Fennec Fusiliers by comparison they are ubiquitous. Obviously, they're going to be in just about every single Kestrel Colonial Force list. And even if we briefly take our exclusively Pan-Oceanian Kestrel player internal faction balance hat off for a moment, they are an enviable line infantry style of profile. They have multiple really interesting profiles, they can link effectively, they can have models added to their link to do really good things. There is just a ton going on with these guys, and Kestrel is frankly privileged to have access to them. You should look at all of the different profiles that are available here. There are multiple that are very interesting. There are a ton of different ways to use them. I have an enormous amount of time for Fennec Fusiliers. C tier. Now, continuing on through the Fs, we get to Firefly's Clandestine Demo Squad. Now, this is a profile that made, this is a regiment, right, that made a splash, but it made a splash when it arrived because of one profile, which is the Mine Layer Turret profile. And if we are being really blunt, that's the profile that we're all still interested in. Yes, there is some play. You could duo an engineer with a tag, for example, but you know what else you could do? You could duo a Mine Layer Firefly with an engineer, and you should do that. That was used in the list that won CanCon this year, and it is going to be on my list of things to play when I get around to playing Kestrel at some point on the channel. You can take multiple of these profiles. You probably shouldn't. Fireflies are a 1 or 2 of per list because NCO has diminishing returns, but I think genuinely they are a 1 or 2 of per list. The Marksman Rifle Turret, unless turrets change at some point in future, Mine Layer, Marksman Rifle Turret, slap some baggage into the list, multiple baggage into the list if you need to. The ability to just spend those NCO order or orders, moving link teams around, even if that link team, for example, is a Tikbalang Lieutenant +1 order and a Firefly, that's a horrifying, horrifying team. You don't need an engineer in that team. The Tikbalang will be fine. But do you know what you do need to do every turn with a Tikbalang? Pull it back from an offensive piece that it's moved to. And since you are pulling it back to a safe location, well, why not use the NCO orders for that? And since we're moving the Tikbalang, why not use that to lay a marksman turret? And if you're doing that 1 or 2 times every turn, the defensive debt that builds up on your opponent is massive. You don't need multiple Fireflies to do that. 1 is enough, 2 is excellent. More is superfluous, so they're not like Fennec Fusiliers, for example, where you might take tons of them, but they are going to go down in history as one of the defining pieces of Kestrel Colonial Force, at least early in the edition. Next up, we have Fugazi Dronebots. Now, there's not a lot to say about these. They're availability 1 in Kestrel Colonial Force. Sometimes you're going to have to exclude them from lists because either there isn't space for them, you're looking to do things exclusively, for example, with troop profiles that can do things, and sometimes, because of the power of baggage in Kestrel Colonial Force, they're going to just get displaced by Mulebots. But there is always a place in any faction for access to a 7-point regular order that also has a flash pulse and is a repeater, etc., etc. Just fantastic. I'm spending more time talking about what is truly a baseline unit than I need to, but Fugazi Dronebots are they're great. They're great. This type of trooper is great. On through the Fs, we get to Fusilier Indigo Bipandra. Really should be a B there, but that's fine. Fusilier Indigo Bipandra. What a profile. Now, she was always a profile that you would occasionally see, right? You would occasionally see Bipandra because she was a Whip 13 Doctor. Well, now she's a Whip 13 Doctor with a reroll, which actually makes her one of the best Doctors in the game. In terms of her chance to succeed, she's very comparable with almost the best Doctors in Hack Islam. Yes, it's reroll -3, but being able to roll a 13 and then a 10 makes her equivalent to something like a Whip 16.5 Doctor, something like that, which is really good. It's not quite Hack Islam, but it's about as close as you can get without being a Hack Islam Doctor. On top of that, tactical awareness on a profile. Hot damn. And she's a wild card, and she counts as both Fennec and Kestrel for purposes of link teams. That's just super high utility. Now, you can't afford that kind of a piece. She is still 25 points. You can't afford that every single list. But if you are looking to run a Fireteam Haris of something like, for example, a gunfighting piece, a Firefly, and then something else that counts as a Kestrel trooper, she's a very natural choice. I like her a lot. She's not actually in every single list that I think I'm building for Kestrel Colonial Force. There are times when she leaves because there are some other... It's just a question of the internal competition in the faction, right? There are things that will outcompete even Bipandra, but as a utility element, particularly in scenarios that have a paramedic or doctor bonus, very, very good. Next up, we have Fusilier Indigo, Richard Quinn. And Richard Quinn is another one of those pieces that I just haven't seen up here yet in Kestrel Colonial Force lists. I'm sure there's someone out there who is a diehard Fusilier Indigo Richard Quinn fan. And yes, technically he has picked up some buffs over the course of the edition change. Immunity, Armor, and Warhorse. and it's a multi-marksman rifle with an MSV1 and serviceable ballistic skill, and it's linkable, but the thing is that costs 26 points, and in this faction, if you want gunfighting, you have some of the best choices in the game. And since you have some of the best choices for gunfighting in the game, it raises the question as to what the heck the use case of Fusilier Indigo Richard Quinn actually is. There is never a circumstance where I need to pay 26 points for an okay gunfighter in Kestrel. I have outstanding gunfighters, what I need is to fill the list in around them, and Richard Quinn doesn't do that. Now, out of the Fs and into the Gs with Griffin troops, Heavy Tactical Regiment. This is a regiment that I will admit I underestimated on first glance. I looked at them and I saw it's an orc with an MSV. That's pretty good, I guess. And that assessment is not inaccurate. A Griffin troop is an orc with an MSV. That's pretty good, I guess. And that's what I underestimated, is just how useful having a simple, solid, effective, good gunfighting kind of piece is, especially when we're talking about very, very flexible link options. The Griffin counts as everything in the links that he might join. He counts as a Fennec in Fennec links, he counts as a Kestrel troop in Kestrel links, which means that it's just easy to put a Griffin into a list in ways that it's sometimes not. We're going to get to a Hetari very soon, in ways that it's not always easy to put a Hetari into a list. Hetari are really, really good, but they don't count as anything, so they rely more on support from other staff or to go it solo, and they have lower range bands on the main gunfighting profile. The Griffin troop just has that wonderful luxury of it can see through smoke, it's got an MSV, it's got good ballistic skill, and it has Feuerback or HMG range bands, and it links with everything. The practicality of the Griffin troop is what sets it apart, and even though it's not an every list kind of profile, because nothing in Kestrel is an every list profile except for maybe Fennec Fusiliers, it's something that I underrated at first glance, and I think looking at the Griffin from the perspective of the Pan-Oceanian player jumping into play Kestrel, it deserves some recognition. Now, from the Griffin, we go to the Hetari, and the hits keep rolling here. The Hetari Shooter is just an absolutely fantastic piece. It is honed to do a single thing, and that is win face-to-face rolls. Now, it does bear mentioning that in the same way that the Griffin was something I think I underestimated at first glance, the Hetari is something that I think I overestimated at first glance. Yes, the Hetari is one of the best pieces in the game at winning a face-to-face roll. That's kinda undeniable. There are a few things that will stymie it, but they are very, very few and far between. However, it is worth noting that it's fighting with a multi-red fury, which means that the damage of the weapon can sometimes let you down, and the range bands of the weapon can sometimes let you down. Now, with a red fury, you can just fight at long range if you need to, because the Hetari is packing BS attack -3 and native ballistic skill 14 and marksmanship, and is linkable to go to burst 5, so it's probably not the end of the world if you have a -3 to hit, you'll be okay. But it is absolutely worth noting that if you are fighting a total reaction bolt with a thunderbolt at 30 inches, the delta between the Hetari Shooter and the Griffin really begins to disappear, and at that point the expense of the Hetari is maybe not as justifiable as it was. It's still a piece that I think is very, very good, just because you can't in good conscience look at that gunfighting profile and say it's anything other than excellent, but it's not exactly ubiquitous. It's just one of many really good tools in the toolkit for Kestrel. Up next is Nauf, and Nauf is a piece a little bit like Emily that feels like he's been added to this faction for some kind of thematic reason, and he's not needed here. He's not needed or particularly wanted. There are some places where Nauf is kind of an interesting and solid piece, even if the addition has left him behind a little bit. A 31-point active gunfighter with a single wound that can't do things like, for example, smoke shoot is a piece I'm a little bit reticent about. But all Nauf does is gunfight, and in Kestrel we do not need a single wound piece that gunfights. We have access to redundant, multi-wound, powerful, better quality gunfighters than Nauf. And while you could theoretically do something like take him and take Fusilier Bipandra to have a good doctor to bring him back, even without the cube not being able to reroll, you've got a good chance. This is all trying to build sort of like a Hackislam gunfighting playstyle, and we are reviewing this faction from the perspective of Pan-Oceania. Pan-Oceania does not need to do that. It's not part of the Pan-Oceanian wheelhouse. There are better ways to accomplish what you might be seeking to accomplish with Nauf. He's something that can really safely be kind of ignored in the context of the faction. Next, we have Machinists, another baseline good quality piece. It's worth noting that there is a Kestrel profile that has access to Mimetism and it pays the points that you would expect, coming in at 20 points if you want a Mimetism and Turret profile. Most of the time you'll pay 18 points. You'll dispense with the Desert Terrain, you'll dispense with the Mimetism, but it is nice sometimes to be able to have access to that. The Machinist is where you go if you are looking for a pure engineer. And because this is Pan-Oceania, with tags, with combat remotes, etc., sure, there's plenty of occasion for a piece like a Machinist in the faction. It's good, solid baseline capability, good to have access to, just a solid piece. It doesn't really need a ton of talking about. Every faction has something like this, and the Machinist is not therefore doing something that is really like, oh, you should really call this out. But in the context of a faction with remote presence tags, you need to remember that the Machinist exists, because even with Willpower 12, being able to reroll your repairs on remote presence tags is something that, for example, with Squalos, or with Tikbalang, or even with just the humble Sierra Dronebot, you need to know that a model like this is there. You need to include this in your battle plans, in your list construction, often enough for it just to be considered solid, sound, and baseline. Next up, we have the first of two Maximuses. Thanks, Corvus Belli, for reusing the same logo for each case. That makes this tier list very not easy. Now in this case, because this is alphabetical, we are talking first about Maximus, Optimate and Hexadome Legend, which is the tag version of Maximus. Now here's a weird, niche, interesting piece. For a model that is a Silhouette 6 but otherwise kind of main battle, because he's costed as a main battle tag. Right? There's no getting away from the fact that he has 76 points, but there's also no getting away from the fact that he costs at most a half an SWC. That is an SWC price point that you can actually make use of in Kestrel. It affords you luxuries like, for example, the Blink team that you might not otherwise be able to take as easily if you're building a full list complement otherwise. And he's genuinely pretty durable. He's very, very hard to engage in close combat. He can win close combat fights himself. And even though he's only armor 6, he has immunity armor and 4 wounds, transmuting into Operator Maximus after the first 3 wounds are done to a tag. And there's like 4 wounds is 4 wounds structure, rather. He's also immune to possession because he's just a guy in armor. And so there's all of these things like that's interesting. That's interesting. But 76 points is a lot, and the elephant in the room is that his weapon of choice is a ballistic skill 14, no mods, Thunderbolt +2 burst. Now he has ballistic skill attack SR -1, just like almost every tag does, but that only takes a Thunderbolt from damage 6 to damage 5, which means that what he's effectively packing is a generic heavy machine gun without any burst advantages, with maybe kind of a range advantage at very long ranges. And for 76 points, he is a worse gunfighter than a Griffin because a Griffin has an MSV. And so the question really is either 1, are you desperate for SWC? Or 2, can you make use of all of the rest of the kit that Maximus is packing because you need to? Because he is hugely more expensive than a Griffin despite being a worse gunfighter, a significantly worse gunfighter in much of the case. And so you have to have a plan for making use of all of the pig. Now, I think, putting on a Pan-Oceanian hat here, there are lists, if we stretch ourselves, we move beyond the generic Pan-Oceanian game plan, there are lists that can make use of Maximus, and I have seen Pan-Oceanian and Kestrel lists that use him, but they are rare because they're playing a little bit against the grain and trying to do weird or interesting things, which is good, but we have to acknowledge as a result that he's niche. Moving on through the M's into Mines Corp Jackals. And there are kind of 2.5 profiles that are worth discussing, but they are worth discussing for the Mines Corp. Mines Corp Jackals are split into FTO profiles that you will generally be only taking if you can link them with the Magistrate. And I mentioned before that the Haris slot in Kestrel is contested, but one of the very good uses for it is to Haris team a pair of Mines Corp Jackals with a Magistrate. If you can't do that, you can absolutely still duo a single Mines Corp Jackal with a Magistrate, and that is entirely worth doing. But really, it's just worth doing as a, well, this is 6 points for a model with a boarding pistol and some other kind of gun. The Submachine Gun Panzerfaust and Light Rocket Launcher profiles both have a boarding pistol and can be linked, so cool, that's useful, and it is even cheaper than a Fugazi to be a regular order, provided you have a Magistrate to pair it with. The more interesting profiles are the Infiltrator ones, although realistically I think there's one that we are most interested in, and that is you fork out the half an SWC and the 11 points, which is the most expensive by a small margin, for the Infiltration Mine Layer profile. It's got a boarding shotgun, a boarding pistol, shock mines with Mine Layer, with Infiltration, and an EM grenade launcher. And this is one of the pieces that I said makes Emily just kind of weird and superfluous. Because, okay, yes, Emily has a higher ballistic skill, but a Squalos has a higher ballistic skill than Emily. But the Minescorp Jackal, in addition to doing a bunch of other useful things, it's laying a mine in the midfield. It's got a boarding shotgun and a boarding pistol. In addition to all of those things, if you want to spend that irregular order at any point during the turn, you can just huck a spec fire, and something magical might happen. And for 11 points, as a model that is already doing other things in a list, that is something I have a lot of time for. Now, I have seen some spam versions of the list where it's like, oh, I'm going to put four Minescore Jackals in my Combat Group 2. That's actually way more viable than you would think. If you're just like, Combat Group 2's entire job is to defend, spec fire, and lay mines, that's fine. That's totally okay, actually. It's a weird list, but that's like if you take a Fugazi Dronebot and 4 Minescore Jackals, Infiltration Mine Layer in Group 2, well, congratulations. That's less than 50 points for your entire second 5-person combat group, and you can go ham, provided you have the SWC, in your first group. That's really cool, actually. That's genuinely super interesting, and even if you have just 1 or 2 of them, having a more sensible, irregular order count, I think they complement Kestrel really, really nicely. We can pair them with things like Peacemaker Dronebots and Yamabushi for midfield presence. Just really solid. I like basically both of those options for Minescorp Jackals, and both of them find their ways into my list. Up next, we have the Mulebot. It's got baggage. At this point, everyone knows why baggage is really, really good in N5. We don't need to talk about it. It's a super, super relevant part of any list that incorporates those marksman turrets on Fireflies, and therefore it's just a really important piece to know exists. Now, from here, we get into the O's with Optimate Agent Maximus. This is Maximus in his medium infantry form, and why profile? I mean, I know why he exists. It's because they sold Maximus as an infantryman and a tag. And for all of the other profiles where they did that and then removed those tag pilots from the game, they're like, oh crap, we better give you some way to use these, which is why all of the tag comp profiles exist. But Maximus is just like a fighty man, and he can't join any links, so he's just playing around by himself. And he's 40 points for a no wounding cap dude that is doing a budget version of all of the stuff that Tag Maximus does for more SWC. And my brother in Christ, I do not want to pay 1 SWC and 40 points for a ballistic skill 12 heavy machine gun. I don't care what else the heavy machine gun is doing. If you want to use Max, well then there's the tag profile right there, but we can just put Maximus, Optimate Agent Maximus, in with the other characters that don't really need to exist, Kestrel being a rare example of a faction where there's like 1 or 2 really, really good character glow-up profiles, but Foot Maximus is not one of those. Up next, Palbots. They're Palbots. They're very, very good to have access to. Every faction does. We don't really need to assess them, but hey, good to have, good to know that they exist. They're a very, very important regiment that you include in lists without really thinking about why they're important. Into the P's now, and we have Pathfinder Dronebots. And Pathfinder Dronebots in Kestrel Colonial Force have the very interesting distinction of being what should on paper be one of the most interesting wildcards in the game that actually we don't take particularly much. And the reason for that is that there is a 17-point tactical awareness profile. If you want to absolutely spam the hell out of orders, you take 2 of these and you wildcard them into link teams somehow. You go Pathfinders and Squalos. You go Pathfinders, well, not Pathfinder and Lieutenant Tick Belang, that's better run because it's the NCO, it's the Lieutenant profile, you make use of the Lieutenant orders, or you just have NCO orders some other way. But if you really, really want to spam orders in Kestrel, one of the ways to do it is to take those 17-point Pathfinders where, hey, they're actually one of the higher whip specialists in the faction. On top of that, this is an addition where Sensor and Deactivator collectively solve quite a lot of problems in the game. If there is an annoying minefield and you can get up behind a wall and sensor through it and deactivate through that wall, you can, with some orders, very reliably, you need to roll 19s or less on a couple of D20 rolls, you can very reliably clear problematic terrain element or problematic equipment elements without ever exposing yourself to their trigger area or line of fire. The reason why I don't think, like, I've seen a couple of lists that use Pathfinders in this capacity, use them to go really, really ham on orders, is that I just don't think that's actually how Kestrel particularly often wants to play. Yes, orders are well and good, but the nature of a tactical awareness order on a Pathfinder is that you can only use it for maneuvering a link, or for doing those utility things. And that's useful, and you will find a Pathfinder make its way into lists as a result. But Kestrel, I think, wants to be more judicious and focused. It's not really hurting for orders, right? Kestrel is a faction that has access to plenty of other tactical awareness pieces and some of the best NCO pieces in the game, thanks to the Mine Layer Firefly profiles, and has ample tactical awareness. You don't necessarily just need to spend 17 points and a troop slot on yet another tactical awareness order. You have what you need. Kestrel almost always has what it needs in terms of orders. And so the more significant concern is accomplishing the mission and winning face-to-face rolls and doing all of the things that you need to do to win the game. And while a Whip 13 Forward Observer Specialist, a Sensor, a Gizmo Kit, and Tactical Awareness Order are all valuable contributions, they're not the locus of that plan. And so I think Pathfinder Dronebots, despite being high utility, exist in a faction of hugely high utility. And so they're competing against that. They're a sometimes choice, a serviceable sometimes choice. From here, we move on to the vehicle of Pan-Oceania, the Redeye Close Support Squad, which again we've actually seen a miniature for now, and I can't get away from the fact that I would swear there is a little man riding a drone, because the targeting aperture on top of it looks like a little dude with a round helmet. Now, the Redeye is a piece that I have not played with or against, but I've read battle reports, I've had reports from other players, very competent other players that have used it and who like it. I don't quite share the full same level of enthusiasm as they do. I've articulated on the channel in the past that I think we really have to acknowledge a lot of the very significant weaknesses that are baked into every vehicle profile. No cover is the most significant negative malice rule in the game, particularly when combined with being Silhouette 7. There are entire factions that have ostensibly very good vehicles, but who also want to take main battle tags, and if you take a main battle tag and a very good vehicle, and you have one building in your Empire deployment zone that can conceal a Silhouette 7 miniature, well, you have to choose. You have to make Sophie's choice as to which one of these pieces lives or dies, and brother, it is rarely going to be the main battle tag. Now, Kestrel does come with a caveat that although they have main battle tag-esque pieces, there's nothing else in the entire faction that is Silhouette 7. You don't have to find somewhere to put a Jotun, for example, and a Redeye, which means that if you need to, you can prioritize protecting the Redeye and have it either as a very high mobility or pop-up kind of assault piece. It's also the most heavily armed and heavily armored vehicle. Now, its points cost reflects this. By God, it is expensive. 44 points and 1.5 SWC is a mile ahead of every other vehicle in the game. But given the absence of comparable pieces in the faction, right, there are not really any other ultra high mobility elements that we might necessarily be reaching for that fill this kind of role. We get plenty of mobility in Kestrel, but we get it by moving in a kind of normal way, by spending orders, moving out, taking fights, moving back, behind the wall of turrets, etc. And so the Redeye, at least theoretically, is something that is capable of doing stuff that is outside of the faction's normal paradigm. That alone makes it interesting, even if it's not a piece that I am leaping out to really personally endorse. I think we have to pay attention to the fact that it has potential and that players... Okay, so this is a little bit of a selection bias problem, but the players who I know who have played the Redeye Close Support Squadron are people who make everything in the faction work. So it's very difficult to actually tell if the Redeye is natively good or if Lockie is natively just probably one of the best Pan-Oceanian players in the world. And in that context, it's difficult for me to confidently say that the Redeye is as good as he tells me it is, but he tells me that it's pretty good, and I'm willing to take his word for that. Next up, and we're in the closing stretch now, moving on into the S's, is the Scarecrow Active Recon Group. Now, this is a piece that I would have absolutely salivated over in N4, but we have a different opinion now. We have seen what everything else in the game costs in terms of hidden deployment, etc. And my basic take on the Scarecrow Active Recon Group is that it is a well-costed, attractively costed piece, and it does something that is unique to the faction, which is that it is an infiltrating specialist. We just don't really otherwise have access to those in Kestrel Colonial Force, and there are so many missions in the game that are just made easier and more convenient if you have a model that starts next to the objective, hidden and safe. And the Scarecrow fulfills that role. Now, it's also quite good at gunfighting. It's ballistic skill 13, it's mimetism 6, it has surprise attack, but it is generally packing very short range weapons. There's not a single sniper rifle, for example, to be seen. And so my basic recommendation is that you really think of the Scarecrow as having a single profile, which is pretty much the KHD, maybe the regular HD some of the time. It is a specialist element primarily, but because of its ballistic skill, camouflage, surprise, mimetism, it can pivot if it needs to taking gunfights. And look, a submachine gun is not a good weapon, but a submachine gun against an opponent out of cover that's being -12 by your modifiers, well, that will do. And so the Scarecrow is a piece that is very high utility, absolutely not in every list, because not every mission will call for it, not every combat circumstance will call for it, but a very good piece to have access to. And at 27 points and 0 SWC, the KHD is my personal pick for best Scarecrow and what we're kind of judging it on here. Sierra Dronebot is up next, continuing on through the S's. And at this point, I think everyone can kind of acknowledge that a total reaction bot, particularly with a Thunderbolt because it's cheap, and an engineer with a turret and a baggage bot behind it is a good combination. And that combination exists in Kestrel, and you can avail yourself of it in Kestrel. Now, you need it marginally less in Kestrel because we have access to mine layer turrets. There are just whole other worlds of possibility that await us that don't require having a Sierra Dronebot go down and then recover it and then have it go down and then recover it and generally be annoying to your opponent. But it is nevertheless just one of those pieces of strong baseline capability that any given list should consider that we have access to. It's just the same kind of piece that everyone else has, and it is almost as useful in Kestrel as it is in many other factions. It just has a little bit more competition. Up next, we have the Squalos Mark II. Pour one out for my boy, the Squalos Mark I, forever in our hearts. Now, as much as I miss the Squalos Mark I, the Squalos Mark II is a very good profile. I have an endless amount of time for Silhouette 6 high-quality tags, because Silhouette 6 is just easier to use than Silhouette 7. And a significant part of my comments about the Redeye come from the fact that Pan-Oceania Kestrel Colonial Force have access to probably some of the most premium Silhouette 6 tags in the game. You can play the Pan-Oceanian game, you can play tags, and you can take a Redeye, and they're not fighting for the same real estate to hide in. Now, the Squalos is it's our classic Pan-Oceanian tag. It has the big guns and the big ballistic skill number. They can be duoed, and I have played against a list that has a Squalos duo. But unlike some other duoable tags, none of the Squalos profiles, except potentially the very cheap multi-marksman rifle, need to be duoed. You can get by just fine on that colossal ballistic skill 15, good armor, good BTS, good structure count, and a big gun. I also have a particular fondness for the grenade launcher profile, because ballistic skill 15 +1 damage spec fire is just a cool tool to have in the back pocket. And if you wanted to build a really highly defensive Kestrel Colonial Force list, then striking out with speculative fire from behind your defenses is genuinely a way to, frankly, infuriate your opponent. Realistically, though, the NCO is going to be one of the more common profiles that you might use. The reason why I'm not leaning toward the NCO as the automatic go-to, even though it does have the multi-HMG and armor-piercing rounds are very important, is that we have some other... Okay, we have the Firefly. The Firefly is a really, really good NCO, and NCO has diminishing returns, so whether or not you might take the NCO Squalos is a little bit your choice. If, for example, you were to take the HMG grenade launcher Squalos and the multi-marksman rifle Squalos as a duo, that would be expensive, but it can be afforded in Kestrel. And then you have armor-piercing rounds on the multi-marksman rifle and big gun and spec fire on the other. Ultimately, your choice. I don't really have any bad things to say about any of the Squalos profiles, and it's just a quintessential Pan-Oceanian tag that enables other elements in the list. Excellent profile. Up next, and technically in the T, we have the Team Crux Father Knights. Now, these are just an absolute grab bag of profiles that we are going to, as best we can, try and talk about collectively, but really it is worth noting that there is just a colossal difference, for example, between the hidden deployment, forward deploying, surprise attack, armed turret, combi rifle, AP submachine gun profile, and the ones that people are more likely to take, which are the FTOs, in particular the multi-marksman FTOs. Now, the big thing to talk about here, just apart from the grab bag of skills, the high durability, the good ballistic skill, the reasonable close combat, etc., is one, albedo -6 on an actual gunfighting profile. Yes, we have albedo otherwise on the Firefly, but the Firefly is mostly not going to be gunfighting. The Team Crux Father Knight is, and it's interesting because the Father Knight is a good gunfighter regardless of whether or not albedo applies, but if albedo applies, it's a really, really good gunfighter. And the reason why it's a good gunfighter regardless, which makes albedo much more usable, is that it's ballistic skill 14 with ballistic skill attack +1 special die. Now, this is kind of a fascinating tool because +1 special die is not the same as +1 burst. In active turn, it's nominally a little bit worse. If we're taking that multi-marksman rifle and we're putting him in a link, we're going to get +2 special die, which means the most hits that we're connecting with are 3, and we will often hit with 3 hits with that multi-marksman rifle, but we might also sometimes hit with 4. Ballistic skill 14 is good enough that sometimes the special die actually do result in you leaving money on the table, even if ultimately 5 dice with that thing is still going to be fantastic and will be scary and will leave a mark. It's only damage 7, but it is still armor piercing. Sorry, I tell a lie. Read the profile, Rob. It's damage 5, which is excellent, but this is part of why you take the multi-marksman rifle. Spoke without thinking there. The other reason why you might take the multi-marksman rifle over the Spitfire, in addition to the fact that it's cheaper and costs no SWC, is that in reactive turn, +1 special die still applies, and you have double action rounds from the multi-marksman rifle that's damage 5, which means that as a reactive piece, the Team Crux Father Knight in a little 3-person Haris team is still firing 3 die in reactive with double action rounds. Now, it's only ever going to be able to hit a maximum of once, but overcoming ballistic skill 14 with 3 die, particularly when you can't really smoke shoot the Father Knight because he has albedo -6, it's just a fascinating problem that you sometimes have to solve. Now, it's a piece that will require absolute experience to maximize, because the range bands, like the 24-inch range band on the marksman rifle as an ARO piece, is something that you need to use very judiciously. Similarly to the Hetari Shooter, you need to be very careful using it in active turn. But the Father Knight ultimately is a piece that has potential. I think it's not going to be the first thing that you lean for in many lists. It's expensive enough, 46 points for that profile, or 50 points for the same profile with strategic deployment, the FTO strategic deployment profile. That is a hard ask for a list. You can spend a few more points and get an entire tag with the same weapon, etc., etc. So mileage may vary, and he's also competing with things like the Hetari and the Griffin, etc. It's not easy to include a Father Knight, but I think we will absolutely see lists from time to time that make use of the Father Knight. And if you were a player that really likes the idea of this profile and you spent time with it and you learned how to position it and what its strengths and weaknesses are, I think it would reward you. Next up, Tech B Maintenance Battalion, which is the TAG Com profile for Kestrel Colonial Force. Frankly, she is one of the better TAG Coms. She has a deactivator and a gizmo kit, and a deployable repeater, and she's 9 points for a regular order. And TAGCOM, all of those things collectively for 9 points makes her one of the order-generating pieces of choice. It's just that stuff that's competing with her include things like baggage bots, which you need to have in a Kestrel list much of the time. In terms of sheer utility, though, super high. And if you're running a very, very tag-heavy list, she becomes particularly useful because at that point, TagCom starts paying serious dividends. You will actually make significant use of TagCom, both the dodge bonus most of the time, but also even the gizmo kit bonus some of the time. I have played into a triple tag list, and it is horrifyingly viable, but it relies kind of on using gizmo kits to recover downed tags and things like Speedball, because all of those tags are so expensive that you genuinely can't afford anymore the full engineer support package. But because she's got the gizmo kit herself, and she's got gizmo kit Fizz +1, you actually have, I wouldn't use it on a tag that was just wounded, but a tag that is downed and you have no other way to efficiently recover, genuinely not a bad choice. TagCom adds up, being specialist operative adds up, being a regular order adds up, the deactivator and deployable repeater are both kind of niche but nice, just a really well-rounded profile to have access to in a support role. Next up, and last of the tags, and one that I have almost nothing bad to say about at all, is the Tikbalang Armored Chasseurs Regiment. The only thing that you can say against the Tikbalang is that it does not have armor-piercing rounds. That's it. Everything else about this profile is an absolute banger. My personal preference is the Lieutenant +1 order profile. You can take Chain of Command if you need, or you can just wear it and take the Tikbalang without any Chain of Command, because if it dies, you're probably losing the game anyway. And you have in one profile, a singular gunfighter that is just almost unequaled in faction. Its durability, its maneuverability, its power, its damage output, its role as your lieutenant, the extra orders that it brings, the fact that it has tactical awareness and 2 lieutenant orders, like just a 10 out of 10 slam dunk profile. My personal favorite duo in all of Kestrel Colonial Force is a Tikbalang Armored Chasseur Regiment and a Mine Layer Firefly. Yes, you could take the Engineer, but the Tikbalang is just going to win gunfights itself an awful lot of the time, and you have access to Speedball if you need. And the defensive debt that your opponent accrues just laying down turrets using the lieutenant orders with the NCO function of the mine layer Firefly is just incredibly high. This is one of the tools that carried Hector, the winner of CanCon 2025, to victory, and it horrifies me and I wanted to play it. Nothing bad to say about the Tikbalang, it earns its spot on this tier list. Next up, and third to last, the Trauma Doc. The butt of many jokes, frankly, because it is the only Willpower 12 Doctor that I'm personally aware of in the game. But ultimately, it's rendered just kind of redundant by the existence of Fusilier Bipandra. The fact that Kestrel has a genuinely good doctor means that if your battle plan in any way involves having access to doctoring things, you just don't need to take the Trauma Doc. It doesn't do anything that is necessary to the faction, whereas Bipandra, if you want to lean into that as a rule, it actually does something that is relevant. So I ultimately can't say that I have ever seen a Trauma Doc appear in a Kestrel Colonial Force list anywhere, and kind of with good reason. Now, she is ultimately just 14 points, but she's so thoroughly outcompeted that if you're in this by Bipandra in this role, if your plan involves needing a doctor, you have access to an actual doctor, not a Trauma Doc. Finally, into the Ws now, we have the War Corps War Correspondent, the regiment with the most employed by this faction icons in the entire game. And it's 3 points. That's it. It's 3 points with a flash pulse. It's even a specialist, and it's a willpower 13 specialist, which means that if you need to fill points out, you absolutely can with War Corps. Now, I think Kestrel Colonial Force uses War Correspondents probably a little bit less than some other factions might, even though it's a willpower 13 specialist, which is a little bit rare in Pan-Oceania, because you only want to take so many irregulars in a list, and jackals are right there. And those infiltrating mine layer jackals are super awesome, and I want to take lots of them. And if I take lots of them, I probably shouldn't take a war corps. But particularly in a list that is top heavy elsewhere and just wants to take one more troop in order to fill the 15th troop slot out because it spent all of its points elsewhere, the war corps is fine. It's good and it's fine. Finally, last and absolutely not least, is the Yamabushi, which is a profile that was hugely well received when it was spoiled, and I think people have kind of come to acknowledge the limitations of it right now, and that limitation is forward deployment +4. This is not a forward deployment +8, it's not an infiltrating piece, it really is bound to deploy quite close to your deployment zone. And it is also not incredibly mobile. It's 6-2 move, but it's just 6-2 move. Now, in my opinion, the Yamabushi is still excellent. How could it not be? It is a regular model that does a bunch of... It projects a lot of threat from underneath the camouflage marker, and if your opponent comes particularly close to your deployment zone, it combines like Libertos-style defenses with the fact that it conceals a Panzerfaust with genuinely scary close combat. Those are really useful attributes to have access to, even if the dream of the Yamabushi, which is close assaulting your opponent's deployment zone and stabbing a bunch of people with that weird close combat weapon that he has, is actually very difficult to realize. It's still a very efficient, scary defensive profile that capitalizes on opponent overextension and is very good, for example, at hunting things that end up in the midfield, even if it is really kind of difficult for it to push further than that in an order-efficient way. Still a very good piece, incredibly useful, and fantastic for Kestrel to have access to, even if we do need to acknowledge the limitations that it has in terms of like launching those long bomb Lang Kai style close assaults. It's not Lang Kai, but we're not comparing it against Lang Kai because, as a reminder, this is purely an internally focused Pan-Oceanian hat on, assessing all of these pieces from the perspective of the Pan-Oceanian Kestrel Colonial Force player. And so that's it. There's the tier list. I hope very much that you've enjoyed this video. I'll leave it on screen for a moment for you to do a screenshot if you'd like to share this or talk to other people about it. How did you rank these different pieces? Where would you rank these different troops? As a reminder, if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description below or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has so far. This video was released a little out of sequence on a relevant day. I had time to do a recording and I wanted to, so I hope you enjoy very much this out of sequence video. We will otherwise be back next week on a regular schedule, weekend release with more videos coming up, and I hope to see you then. Finally, oh shit. Oh, this is really embarrassing. I just used the default S through F tier maker. I didn't change the rankings. Hang on, let me just do that now. There we go. All fixed. I hope very much that you've enjoyed this Pan-Oceanian player tier list done from and for the Pan-Oceanian player to objectively rank on a truly fair scale all Pan-Oceanian Kestrel Colonial Force regiments. Happy April Fools, everyone, and I'll see you next time.